Mugs might easily be the pot I've made the most of during my life, be it for my own practice or the thousands I made during my apprenticeship with Lisa Hammond. You might think that after all these years I would tire of them, yet to this day I still always look forward to throwing a batch. I'm eager to trim them and to pull their handles. And in this video I want to discuss not only their creation, but also my making philosophies for these functional pots, which are both inherently simple and highly functional. Here's my rough throwing setup. I keep my wedged up balls of clay wrapped up in plastic just to help them remain soft. Then I have a stack of wear boards ready to receive the thrown mugs. In the middle is my Rhoda HMT 500 potter's wheel, then directly to my left are two reclaim buckets. The white one has a sharp rim, so I can scrape the slip off my hands against it, and the other bucket is connected to this wheel tray by a hose, so all the wet slops can slowly drain into that over a couple of weeks until it's full. I throw these mugs from about 290 grams of clay. They're approximately 10.8 centimeters tall and 8.5 centimeters wide, and the first mug of the batch always takes a bit longer to make compared to the others. And this is because I have to measure it with a ruler, and once it's correct, I set the pointer of my throwing gauge just next to the rim. That way, instead of measuring each individual vessel time and time again, instead, all I have to do is throw the pots so the rim comes to a finish right next to the pointer. The pointer itself can be flipped up and down, which is handy as it means when I'm wiring the pot off and lifting it away, I don't accidentally knock the soft mug against the rubber point, as a freshly thrown vessel is extraordinarily delicate, and one ill-judged movement is enough to instantly ruin the pot. The shape of this particular mug that I make couldn't be more simple. It has very straight sides, yet as I throw them, my initial focus is on getting the rim up to the rubber gauge or just a touch higher, as when I finish these and scrape this slip off the outside walls, the height tends to drop by 2 or 3 millimeters or so. Ultimately I'll be trimming the sides of these pots, their bases too, but the only part I don't trim is the rim itself. So when I throw large batches of these, perhaps my largest focus is on keeping the strength of the rims identical from pot to pot. Mugs are the kind of object that potters need to be able to throw quickly, especially when you're first starting your world as a professional potter and you might not yet be able to charge all that much for each individual piece. If a single mug takes you 10 to 15 minutes to throw, not to mention the trimming and the handling, then there's a low chance really that you'll be able to turn a profit on such an object. So speed with pots like this is vital, yet you can't skimp on quality, and finding a balance between the two whilst also throwing them fast is something that can take years of practice. I keep the shapes of these mugs simple, not just because they're quick to throw, but because they're the type of shape that I can imagine myself living with and using, and that's the ethos I try to stick to for all the pots I make. My work has always been simple, it's unfussy and the shapes are straightforward, and because that's the case, I try to keep my level of craftsmanship extraordinarily high, as when you're making such simple objects, irregularities and mistakes stick out like a sore thumb. Like I mentioned earlier, it's the rims of these that I think are so vital. I throw the lip so it bevels outward slightly, which is done so the liquid flows out more easily, and so that this soft rounded corner fits comfortably into the corners of your mouth. It comes to a point on the outside of the wall. It doesn't slope inward, nor does it come to a point in the middle of the rim. Rather, its apex is where the wall meets the rim on the outside, and that's what I think is comfortable to use. So I soften the rim with the chamois leather, and now that the walls have been scraped clean of slip, I can slide a twisted metal wire beneath it, quickly dry my hands on the sharp rim of that bucket, and then lift the pot away and set it aside along with all the others. One full board's worth is 24 mugs, and the minimum I usually make is 2 to 3 boards in any one session, although sometimes it's more, and if I spend a full day throwing these, I can easily make 200 to 300 pieces, which is all fine and well, but then all these pieces need to be trimmed and have their handles attached too, and the process of actually finishing that many can take 3 or 4 days. I really love the physicality of throwing quickly. I use a very minimal set of tools, each one having its own important purpose. Yet, none of them are really used until the end of the process, and although it's a cliché saying, a potter's hands really are their best tools, and a very experienced potter can make unbelievably good pots, even if they have subpar tools, especially, I think, at the throwing stage, as the tools we do use are just strips of chamois leather, chunks of wood, scraps of metal, and pieces of sponge lashed onto the ends of dowels. Mugs are always the most popular item in my online shop updates. They're universally functional objects, and most people, even subconsciously, will pick out their favourite mugs to drink tea or coffee from. And to make that ritual even more rewarding, using a hand-thrown mug makes all the difference. Myself, I use a mug made by my Japanese friend Masaki Dejima. I'll leave a link to his Instagram below. Every time I use his mug, I'm reminded of him. I'm reminded of the times we spent teaching each other how to make pots. And every time I clasp the handle or drink from the rim, there's this tangible link. I hold a handle that was pulled with only his hands, that still has fingerprints left on it, marks that were pressed into the soft clay and are now set in stone forever. And as I sip my coffee, I'm reminded of Dejima. Or if I'm using a Maze Hill Pottery sodified mug, I'm reminded of my apprenticeship. Or I may even use a mug made by a potter whom I really aspire to. And I kid you not, using handmade pots does make the experience of drinking tea and coffee so very much more special. And the same really can be said for all manner of types of handmade pots. Mugs just happen to be the gateway drug into the pottery collector's world, and they're also the object most budding potters begin making. Now that these have been thrown, I'll let these mug bodies sit out for a day or two. Just after these have been thrown, the walls of these are very soft and saturated with water, and at this point, if I was to try and pick one up, it would simply squash in my hands. So in order to proceed to the next stage, I leave the mugs sat out overnight so much of the water they contain evaporates, leaving a mug body that's much firmer and one that can be picked up and handled without it deforming. The way you dry pots is almost as crucial as how you throw them. If I was to simply leave these pots outside in the sun, the clay would very quickly turn to what we call bone dry, which is the condition it's in when all the moisture has left it. You can rush pots successfully to this stage as long as you do it evenly, but that isn't usually the case. Instead, pots will dry out unevenly, perhaps too quickly on one side, and when that happens, pots can warp and they can crack. All of this is to say that drying the pots out in an even manner that's controlled is imperative to the process of making pottery. And as a skill, it's one that's learnt simply through experience. As no two studios are the same, and drying conditions change depending on the weather, which country you're in, what type of clay you're using, whether the kiln has been on or off, and all manner of other things. And so, back to these mugs. This is now the morning after, and at this point, the rims are dry enough so that I can flip them upside down, which means the wetter bases of these are now exposed in the open air, and therefore can dry out a bit more thoroughly. Although, these mugs have been sitting on a rather absorbent material overnight. My wearboards are made out of birch ply that's unvarnished, and overnight, the absorbent wood does suck some of the water out from the bottom of these pots, so they aren't sopping wet at this stage. As a rule, I don't let pots dry out on their rims for too long, especially if the rims are thrown quite delicately, as they do have a bit of a tendency to warp. But in some rare cases, what I do is slide these wearboards underneath my gas-firing kiln, and the heat that emanates from it down onto the mostly leather-hard mugs quickly dries them out until they're the perfect condition to trim, which means they need to be just as leather-hard in the base as they are the rim. And I know more or less when they're perfect if I take one of the mugs in my hand and I gently squeeze the rim portion of the pot. If it easily deforms, then the clay is still far too soft to trim. But if the clay is dry enough and has enough resistance to not warp with a tiny amount of pressure, then they should be good to go. That being said, there is no one size fits all, and for your clay and for the type of pots you're making, you might have to treat and trim your clay in a very different way. I trim my leather hard mugs on top of a chuck. It's kept wrapped up in plastic, and every time I use it, I dunk it in water to soften the clay. And by doing this, I've kept it leather hard for more than a year. It's completely solid and thrown with a tapering edge. That way a variety of forms can fit onto it to be trimmed. I tap center the chuck on a small pool of slip, and that's usually enough to hold it in place. And I like using a solid chuck like this, as it lets me trim the walls and the base simultaneously, whilst also ensuring that the rim of the pot stays round as it's pushed down over the leather hard chuck. I then tap center the mug and push it down slightly, and one reason I prefer leather hard chucks is I find they stick just a bit better to the leather hard pots. I then place a spinner on top and push down firmly through this, and this keeps the pot held down firmly in place. I then spend a brief moment trimming the walls of the pot to make sure the shape is straight and to remove any more prominent throwing marks. After the walls of the pot have been trimmed, I move on to the base. I bevel the bottom edge and finish the base, and there are a few details here I need to discuss. The The clay body I use isn't perfectly smooth, and after the mugs have been fired like this, I do sand the bases, but only a touch, as I like the contrast between the smooth, glazed section and the slightly rough, coarse clay. Moreover, if I sand the bare clay too much, I'll remove the toasty brown tones on the outside, revealing what's just a dark, dull grey beneath. The beveled edge itself is important for various reasons. The first is that it creates a band of shadow beneath the pot, separating it from the table. It also makes the point of contact less likely to chip, like a harsh right angle might. Here's an old mug of mine, which doesn't have the beveled edge, and you can obviously see how much more the mug sort of just fades into the tabletop, whereas the mug on the left looks as if it's just about hovering over the table, despite the flaws the mug on the right has. I like it. It's a little clunky, and the handle is thick and very sturdy, but I love the layered glaze effect on the outside. I tend to use clay bodies that contain a lot of iron, and when thrown to sharp edges, they are just more susceptible to chipping in comparison to other clays. I like what the shadow beneath the pot does though. It creates a sort of tension and adds a lightness to the vessel, whereas the way the mug on the right simply blends into the tabletop visually makes it look heavier. So that's what I'm doing at this stage. Not only that, but I trim away the wiring off marks that are left over from the throwing stage, and I also stamp it with my maker's mark, which is my little identifying symbol, so that people can tell if it's a pot I've made or not. Ultimately, there are dozens of ways of finishing the bases of pots. In fact, there are hundreds, if not thousands of ways. And when finishing your own pots, you need to consider what you like both aesthetically and functionally. Here's the process from another angle, which more or less shows what I see as I trim. Although the pots are on the firm side of leather hard, as they're trimmed, softer clay inside the pots is exposed, and I won't immediately try and put handles on these, as doing so could very well cause the pots to be deformed. So instead, after all the mugs have been trimmed, I'll let them sit out for a while to firm up again, which, as we discussed earlier, could take 30 minutes, or it could take an hour, or even longer. But what I want in terms of firmness is to be able to gently squeeze the rim without it easily distorting. If you look at the area underneath where the spinner was, you'll see that there's some texture over this area. These lines are the wiring off marks left from when I sliced the pot off from the wheel just after it's been thrown. You can choose to leave these wiring off marks, as in some cases I think they can look really nice, but in my own work, which is a bit more minimal, which focuses so much on clean lines and sharp edges, these wiring off marks feel just a bit out of place. After these areas have been trimmed, I then use the smooth side and not the edge itself of a metal kidney to burnish over the base of the pot. This compresses the clay and makes it feel just so much smoother. Yet, it's worth noting that once fired, the clay body will shrink around the specks of grog, and once reduction fired, the bases will then feel rough again. So like previously mentioned, each pot is given a quick once over with some soaked wet and dry sandpaper. After this trimming session is over, I remove the chuck and I wrap it back up tightly in plastic, and if it does feel a bit dry, I'll submerge it in water for about 10 seconds before wrapping it up, and then I store it alongside all my other chucks in an airtight box. The next step for these mugs is to have their handles attached. This process begins with a larger block of clay that's slowly stretched out and then separated into dozens of little segments. Each segment becomes its own handle. Essentially, my hand is doing the same thing an extruder might. I create a specific shape between my index finger and thumb, and gradually, and with a lot of water, I slowly pull the clay through that shape. And as I pull, I make the template between my finger and thumb smaller and finer. As I work, I also rotate the lump of clay. That way I pull it from both sides, and it should ensure that the cross-section is even. An extruder does do more or less the same job, but it comes with the caveat that it needs to be cleaned every time you use it, and if you want to extrude a different shaped handle, you have to change the die plate, whereas with this method I can just alter the shape of my hand, and therefore instantly create new shapes. I then lay these lengths out against the very edge of a wearboard, and I use the side of my thumb to snip them off against that edge. On a really hot day, and in combination with the moisture from the clay being absorbed by the wood below, I'll stack all of these blanks up, and I'll even wrap them in plastic and spray them with water, as I want to attach them when they're really still very soft. If these segments dry out too much, they'll only become more difficult to pull when later attached to the mug and pulled again. Once again, This is a process where there are dozens of different ways of doing it. The reason I practice this method is twofold. The first being that it's the way I was taught. I probably pulled 10,000 plus handles like this during my apprenticeships. It's ingrained in me, and these days, it isn't a method you see practiced all that much, perhaps as it has a very steep learning curve to it, and at the beginning, it's especially easy to ruin well-made pots with really terrible handles. As a technique, it also produces handles that look natural, as in they appear almost like they've grown from the pot. They spring out from near the top and loop back down, blending into the base. They look as if they were always meant to be there, as compared to some other methods where the handles look as if they're just tacked on. To prepare the blanks and the handle for attachment, I first score and slip a patch on the mug and then pat one end of the blank out so that it's flared. This flared end provides me with material that I can easily blend into the body of the mug, thus creating a really strong join. I use a dry finger to do this and carefully smear the clay all the way around. Then, once neat and tidy, I soak my right hand and I begin to pull the handle in much the same way as I did before, only this time I make the gap between my thumb and index finger even smaller. And although it's a very fast process, I'm also working very carefully, as if either component dries out too much, the pulled handle will likely stick to my hand and the whole thing will tear away. It's an unusual process really, as you have to be both very forceful about how you move the clay, and at the same time your movements need to be very delicate and highly controlled, and it takes an awful lot of practice, and I certainly destroyed my share of pots when I was learning this skill. Once the length is long enough, I carefully let it loop downward, and then I blend in the bottom join. The handles on these specific mugs are generally large enough to fit 2 fingers inside, and at this stage I hope you can more clearly see what I meant when I said the handle looks as if it's grown from the pot. Clay shrinks as it dries and when it's fired, and that's something that needs to be taken into account when pulling handles, as whilst they may look big enough when freshly pulled, there's a chance they could shrink, and once glazed and fired, you won't be able to fit 2 fingers comfortably in. And for that reason, when I pull mine, I always make them just a touch bigger than perhaps they should be, as you really don't want a mug with such a small gap inside the handle that you burn your knuckles when holding a hot cup of tea or coffee. The bottom is carefully blended in, but I don't need to score and slip that section, mainly due to the angle at which it joins back onto the mug, as I can easily smear in the excess clay to form a very solid join. Perhaps the most important part of making handles this way is how you dry them hereafter. At this point, the stoneware of the mug is much drier than that of the handle, and if I was to leave this pot out in the open air to dry, the 2 components would dry at very uneven rates, and the most likely result if that happens is that the handle cracks and splits around the joins. So to prevent this, I place all of the freshly handled mugs directly onto a board that's covered with plastic. Then, once the board is full of handled mugs, I give them a light spray with water and then I tightly wrap them up. And I'll leave them like this, hidden away for a couple of days. During that time, both the handle and the mug acclimatise to each other and become the exact same firmness. Once I've deemed that that's happened, I'll unwrap them and let them dry out more thoroughly in the open air. And I just use kiln props to pin down the plastic on each end. But before I let them dry out thoroughly, there is one last thing I do. During the handling process, there's a chance that some excess clay is smeared over that beveled edge I so carefully finished earlier on. So I just pop each one back onto the chuck and I check that edge. Usually it's just about here, so I just run a turning tool over it and maybe burnish it again if it needs it. Not every mug needs to be corrected, but there's always a handful that do. This process does one last thing though that is very beneficial. During the handling process, and as these pots dry under plastic, there's a chance the heavier handle will pull the circular rims of these mugs to be a slight oval, and so by forcing them over the chuck that is perfectly circular, any misshapen pots are corrected. And that's it for this individual mug. Only another 80 more to go. At this point I'll leave the mugs uncovered for most of the day, but I'll also keep them loosely covered with plastic, just so the mugs don't dry out too quickly or from one side unevenly. I really want them to dry out very slowly and very evenly to minimise any potential of things going wrong. I hope this video has been an interesting insight into the hows and whys of the mugs I create. If you have any further questions, please do let me know down in the comments. And like always, it's always nice to hear from those who made it all the way through. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.